It started with a letter, a small white envelope tucked into my mailbox with no return address, just the bold letters stamped on the top that read, Homeowners Association, Notification. I live out on a quiet piece of land just outside the development they call Hillstone Oaks. I've owned my land for over 30 years, long before those fancy stucco homes started popping up across the hill. My farm, my rules, my peace. That's how it always was. Until the HOA got it in their heads that their reach extended a little too far. I opened the letter that evening after feeding the chickens. My wife sat on the porch with her cup of tea, looking out over the rows of corn we'd just planted. We were ready for a quiet season, but the contents of that envelope promised anything but dot. It read like a legal warning. According to them, my front pasture where I kept tractors, hay bales, and a few old sheds was now considered shared parking space for overflow residential guests. It said their new easement survey showed the boundary line included the front section of my land. They demanded I cleared the area for vehicle access and guest parking during weekends and holidays. I read it twice. Then a third time, I looked at my wife and said, they must be out of their minds. This was no misunderstanding. This was a move, a bold one. They were trying to claim land they didn't own, land I'd paid taxes on, cared for, lived on, and protected for decades. And the craziest part, they genuinely thought I'd go along with it. Now, I've always believed in keeping peace with neighbors. I've helped folks move furniture, repaired fences that weren't mine, and even let kids from the development ride horses on the trails behind my barn. But this was different. This was trespass wrapped in legal paper. It was push disguised as policy. And I wasn't going to let it stand. The next morning, I drove to their HOA office, a sleek little building just past the community gates, with trimmed hedges and a glass door that looked like it had never seen a calloused hand. I walked in, wearing my boots and work shirt, dust still on my sleeves, and asked to speak with whoever sent the letter. A young woman behind the desk smiled a rehearsed smile and said the manager, Mr. Chandler, would be out shortly. I sat in a padded chair, the kind that makes your back ache after 5 minutes. 10 minutes later, out walks Chandler, slick hair, khakis, and a polo shirt with the HOA logo embroidered on the chest. He extended his hand and said, Mr. Collins. I assume. I nodded but didn't take his hand. He gestured toward his office, and we sat down across a desk that probably cost more than my first pickup truck. I suppose you're here about the letter, he said with a smug kind of calm. I am, I said, and I want to know what gives you the right to tell me what to do with my land. He leaned back and crossed his legs, like he'd done this 100 times. It's not personal, Mr. Collins. Our recent property surveys indicate that the area in question may fall under community easement rights granted when the Hillstone Oaks development was approved. You may not have realized, I've realized plenty. I cut in. I realized you're trying to push me off my own land. That pasture's mine. Always has been. You folks can park your luxury SUVs somewhere else. He raised his hands, as if to say he didn't want trouble. This is just standard policy. If you wish to contest it, there's a process. You can file with the county, but I should warn you, I'm not filing anything, I said, standing up. I'm keeping what's mine. He watched me walk out. No argument, no apology. Just that same smug calm, like I'd already lost. That day, I went home and got to work. I pulled every deed and record I had. Property maps, tax bills, photos of the land dating back to the 90s. I even found the surveyor's mark still etched in stone at the edge of my driveway. There was no question it was my land. A week passed, then 2. And one Saturday morning, I saw it. 3 cars, lined up along my fence. Strangers, men in sunglasses and collared shirts, stepping out, unfolding chairs and tables. One of them waved at me like we were old friends. They were setting up for a community event, a farmer's market or yard sale. I wasn't sure. I walked down the gravel path and asked the first guy, who told you could park here. He laughed. The HOA said, this is the overflow lot. Said it's okay, as long as we don't block your driveway. You're already blocking it, I said. And when I looked back, I saw 2 more cars inching toward the gate. That's when I had enough. The next day, I installed a new fence knot, a cheap chain link one, but sturdy wooden posts sunk deep with barbed wire across the top. I put up signs that read private property, no trespassing, and backed them with cameras. Still, they came. Not every day, but on weekends. Guests, vendors, visitors, from the HOA community. They ignored the signs like they didn't exist. So I made a decision. You see, what the HOA didn't know is that their power junction, a small substation feeding the lighting for their community trails, fountains and clubhouse sat just beyond my eastern fence line, on a sliver of land they never bothered to secure legally. Years ago, during construction, they needed to run a cable through the edge of my property, and a lazy contractor asked me for verbal permission. Being neighborly, I agreed, but they never filed anything formal. No easement, no contract. And they had no idea I still remembered. So I visited that junction box one quiet morning, checked the setup, took a few photos, consulted with my attorney, who confirmed what I already suspected. The equipment sat on my land, and I had every legal right to revoke access. I drafted a letter, simple, direct, effective. It stated that the HOA's unauthorized use of my land, for both parking and infrastructure, would no longer be tolerated. They had 7 days to cease all trespass, remove vehicles, and disconnect any utilities crossing my property, or I would do it myself. I hand-delivered it to Chandler's office. He was less smug this time, a little pale around the edges. He stammered something about reviewing documents and getting back to me. A week passed. Then came the silence. No cars, no vendors, no chairs or tables, just quiet, until a maintenance crew showed up on my side of the fence. Trying to access the power station, I stopped them cold. Showed them the letter. Called the sheriff, who confirmed my land ownership. They packed up and left. The next morning, I walked out with a wrench and shut the line off. Hillstone Oaks went dark. No trail lights, no fountain, no clubhouse. Complaints poured in. Emergency meetings were held. And then the HOA board called me, not Chandler, not a clerk, the entire board. They wanted to negotiate. I sat at that same desk again, this time with my lawyer by my side. They apologized. Said it was a mistake, offered a formal written agreement to never encroach again. They even offered to build a privacy wall and pay a fee for past misuse. I agreed. Under one condition, Chandler resigns. They hesitated, but not for long. The next week he was gone, and my land, peaceful again, fenced, respected mine. That's what happens when people forget where the real lines are, when power makes them bold, but not wise. They thought they could take without asking, assume without confirming, and bully without consequence. But I didn't just own the land, I remembered everything. And I don't forget what's mine. The day I shut off the power, I didn't feel triumphant. I didn't even feel angry. I just felt tired. Tired of being pushed. Tired of watching people with polished shoes and polished smiles act like the ground they walk on always belongs to them. I stood by the fence and listened as the humming of those HOA lights died down, one by one. I knew what it meant. Phones would ring, meetings would be called, and someone would finally listen. That evening, I sat on the porch with my wife. She didn't say much, just nodded toward the quiet hills and said, about time they remembered. Who was here first? She was right. We'd lived on that land before the development, before the manicured sidewalks, before the fake fountains and laminated HOA handbooks. I raised cattle on that soil, grew feed corn, baled hay, fixed fences. In the dead of winter, that land gave me everything I had, and now I had to defend it like it was some disputed territory. The next morning, the fallout began. The clubhouse lost power. Their sprinkler system shut down. Decorative lights along their walking trail went dark. The HOA Facebook group exploded. I was told residents were furious. Not just at me, any of them didn't even know my name, but at their own leadership. Apparently, Chandler had kept most of them in the dark about the legal dispute. He had painted it as a simple misunderstanding with a neighbor unwilling to compromise. But now, with power out and tempers hot, people started digging. And what they found didn't sit well. Turns out, several board members had known about the lack of easement on my land. They thought it could be resolved quietly, that I'd roll over, that I'd never take action. When I didn't back down, their strategy collapsed. Within 48 hours, a handful of residents came to my gate not to argue, but to talk. One man, probably in his 50s, held up his hands and said, look, we're not here to start anything. We just want to understand what's going on. Our kids walk those trails. We pay dues. This situation, it's gotten out of control. I appreciated the honesty. So I invited them to sit, told them everything, showed them the original letter, the photos of the fence line, the records proving my ownership. Their eyes widened. One woman said quietly, they never told us any of this. They made it sound like you were the one stealing land. I said, stealing? I've been on this land since before your houses were blueprints. Another added, they told us you were being unreasonable. I looked them all in the eyes and replied, wanting my land respected is not unreasonable. They left humbled. One even apologized. I didn't need the apology, I just needed the truth to spread, and it did. By the end of the week, more residents began voicing concerns not about me, but about their board. HOA meetings became heated. People wanted to know how they were paying for amenities that sat on land they didn't own. How Chandler could risk cutting corners with infrastructure just to save time or look efficient. Some called for new elections. Others demanded audits. It didn't take long before local news caught wind of the story. I didn't speak to the reporters directly, but they pieced together enough from public records and interviews with residents. One headline read, Farmer shuts down HOA lights after land dispute. Was he right all along? That kind of attention made the board nervous. The last thing they wanted was a legal spotlight. That's when the HOA board asked to meet again. Not in their fancy office, but at a neutral place. They chose the community center at the edge of the neighborhood, still running on backup generators. My attorney came with me, same as before. The atmosphere this time was different. No smug smiles, no sales pitches, just worry, and an eagerness to make it all go away. Their new proposal was more respectful. They acknowledged their mistake. They offered written apologies and guaranteed legal documentation that clearly marked my land boundaries. They would install a barrier of their own to ensure no one crossed the line again. And they offered compensation, not as a bribe, but as a correction. I leaned forward and said, I don't want your money. I want your honesty, and I want Chandler gone. They paused, looked at one another. One of the board members, a woman, who seemed genuinely embarrassed by the whole mess, said, he's already submitted his resignation. We just haven't made it public yet. That was enough for me. We signed the new agreement that day. I kept a copy in a locked cabinet, with everything else I've ever had to fight for. After that, something shifted. The residents stopped looking at me like I was some grumpy old man with a grudge. They waved when they saw me on the road. A few even stopped by with fresh bread or eggs. One high schooler from the neighborhood came over and asked if he could interview me for a local civics project. He wanted to understand property rights, neighborly respect, and what it meant to stand up for yourself. I told him everything. Told him how it started with a letter and almost ended in silence. Told him how sometimes the only way people hear you is when the lights go out. He listened, took notes, and said, I think more people should do what you did. I told him it's not about making noise, it's about knowing where the line is, and never letting anyone cross it without permission. But the story didn't end there. A month later, I noticed something strange. A pair of surveyors standing near the back of my property far from the disputed front pasture. They had a clipboard and measuring equipment. I walked over and asked who sent them. They hesitated at first, then one admitted they were hired by the HOA. They were rechecking the community's back drainage boundary. I asked, you got paperwork for that? They didn't. I called my lawyer. Again, turns out, while the HOA had backed off the front pasture, they were quietly trying to map other areas of the development. Maybe it was routine, maybe not, but after what I'd just been through, I wasn't taking chances. We filed an official cease and desist, put up new signs at the back property line, reinforced the fencing, and I made something else very clear. I'm not here to fight, but I won't be pushed. That final move seemed to seal it. The HOA stopped sending people, stopped measuring, stopped testing the waters. They knew now that I wasn't bluffing, that I knew my land, and I knew my rights. And slowly, the peace returned. The lights came back on. The walking trails lit up again. The clubhouse reopened. But the line between their world and mine, that stayed exactly where it always should have been. Some people learn through words, others through silence. But some only understand when the switch flips, and the power that they thought was theirs suddenly disappears. I didn't do any of this for attention. I did it because no one else was going to protect my land but me. And if I hadn't stood firm, who knows what piece they would have tried to take next. This land raised me, fed my family, watched over my children. It holds stories no HOA will ever understand, and I'll be damned if I let a committee in polo shirts tell me what it's worth. Not today. Not ever. After the dust settled and the lights came back on, I expected to be left alone. I thought that was the end of it. But it wasn't. Not by a long shot. It started with small things. A knock on the gate, an envelope tucked under my windshield at the grocery store. Handwritten notes. People from inside Hillstone Oaks began reaching out, not to argue, not to blame, but to thank me. Some said they hadn't realized how out of control the HOA had become. Others admitted they'd been afraid to speak up themselves. And one couple, both in their 70s, came right up to the fence and said, you did what we all wish we could do. They said they'd lived in the neighborhood for over a decade and watched as the board became less about helping and more about controlling, rules about mailbox colors, fines for garden gnomes, tickets for leaving trash cans visible for more than 30 minutes. It had all added up to fear, frustration, and resentment. But until I took a stand, no one had the courage to challenge it. No one believed they could win. And then they saw me do it. The story had become something of a legend. The farmer who shut down the HOA, I heard it repeated at the feed store, at the diner, and even once on a local radio call-in. Some of it was exaggerated, sure, but the truth always found its way through. People knew I hadn't asked for trouble. I hadn't started the fight. But when it came to my land, I didn't back down. One man, a young father who lived near the development's south end, stopped by with a box of pastries and an old copy of the HOA bylaws. He said, you exposed something they never wanted us to see, and now we're looking at everything. He wasn't kidding. Within a few weeks, a group of residents had organized a petition to call for a full HOA audit. They demanded to see budgets, spending reports, and all property agreements. And what they found was ugly. Misused funds, unapproved construction, hidden fees, and most importantly, zero legal documentation for the so-called overflow easement they tried to use against me. It was all smoke and mirrors. The board had assumed no one would dig, but now everyone was digging. Chandler's resignation had already quieted things a bit, but once the audit findings came out, it lit a fire. Several board members were forced to step down. New elections were called, and for the first time in years, residents felt like they actually had a say. People began waving to me when I drove past. Some even asked if I'd be willing to speak at their next community meeting, not as a protester, but as a neighbor who reminded them of what it means to stand your ground. I agreed, on one condition, that they come to my land for the meeting, not the clubhouse. If they wanted to hear my story, they could stand on the same soil the board tried to claim. They came, dozens of them, folding chairs in hand, notepads in laps, sun hats, sunglasses, and a respectful quiet I hadn't expected. I stood by my barn, with nothing but my voice, and said, "This land was nearly taken from me by people who thought paperwork meant power. But it's not the papers that matter. It's the truth behind them. It's the time, the sweat, the history. That's what they didn't see. But you did. And now it's yours to protect too." It was quiet afterward, a thoughtful kind of silence, and then, they clapped. Not for me, but for what we all stood for. That moment changed something in me. For years, I kept to myself, thought the world was moving too fast, too flashy, too full of people who cared more about convenience than community. But now, I was seeing something different. People wanted real connection. They wanted land they could trust, neighbors they could believe in, and leaders who listened instead of ordered. One woman, probably in her late 40s, said, "We bought our house because the HOA promised order, but we stayed because of people like you." That hit hard. I wasn't trying to be a symbol. I just wanted to be left alone. But sometimes, standing up for yourself means standing up for others too, whether you mean to or not. As the new HOA board took over, things began to shift. Fewer complaints about flower colors, more community cookouts, fewer threats about fences, more focus on real safety. And they kept their word. They installed a permanent barrier between the development and my land: clean, professional, respectful, a physical reminder of the line they'd crossed, and the peace that came after. But not everyone was happy. Some of the old board loyalists still grumbled, said I was too stubborn, said I could have handled it more quietly. But I wasn't trying to win a popularity contest. I was trying to keep what was mine. One day, a letter showed up again. Same envelope, same HOA logo. My stomach dropped. I opened it slowly. But this time it was different. It was a thank you note, hand-signed by the new board. It read, "Thank you for standing firm when others wavered. You reminded us that power is not control, it's responsibility. We're doing better now, because you made sure we had to." I didn't know what to say. I kept the letter in my drawer. A week later, I got a visit from a local councilman. He'd heard about the story and wanted to discuss how private landowners could better protect themselves from overreach. Said he was considering new policy that would require HOAs to document all easement claims with county oversight. I told him, that's a start, but make sure you also teach people what land means to a person, not just on paper. In life, he nodded, said he'd include that in the public hearings. I never thought my fight would reach that far, but here it was, a ripple growing bigger than I expected. Still, I didn't let it change me. The chickens still needed feeding. The crops still needed checking. My life went back to normal. Slowly, but better this time. Quieter, more respected, and with more folks waving hello instead of pretending I wasn't there. And sometimes, late in the evening, I'd sit on the porch with my wife and watch the lights twinkle from across the hill. Those very same lights that once tried to cross a line. Now, they shine from the right side of the fence. That's all I ever wanted. To be seen, respected, left to live, as I always had. On my own land, under my own sky, with both hands in the soil that raised me. Because at the end of the day, land isn't just dirt, it's memory, it's legacy. And no board, no paper, no parking plan is going to take that from me. Not now, not ever. The year rolled on, and life settled back into its steady rhythm. The barn creaked in the wind like it always did. The roosters kept their loud, early promises. My boots still found the same grooves in the soil I'd walked for 30 years. But something about the land felt different, not in its shape or soil, but in how it was seen. For the first time in a long while, people weren't just passing it by on the way to somewhere else. They were slowing down, taking notice, respecting the invisible line that marked where community ends and a man's life begins. One morning, as I fixed a broken latch on the back gate, a boy from the Hillstone Oaks development biked past and shouted, "You're the guy who saved the farm, right?" I just smiled and nodded. He waved and pedaled on, disappearing over the hill. That small moment stayed with me. I didn't save the farm from a fire or a flood. But in a way, I saved it from being erased by paperwork, erased by power, erased by people who never planted a single seed in its ground, but thought they had the right to claim it anyway. I've never been much for speeches, never wanted attention, but what happened that year showed me something I hadn't seen before. that standing up quietly but firmly can echo louder than shouting, that sometimes all it takes to stop a machine is one person who refuses to move, and once that person stands, others will too. Since the HOA saga, more folks from nearby communities reached out. Some asked for advice on their own property disputes, others just wanted to say thank you. A man from a different neighborhood brought over a pie and said, "You gave us hope. My dad lost part of his land to a golf course years ago. If only he'd had someone to fight back. I told him I didn't win by being aggressive. I won by knowing what was mine and not letting go of it." That's the lesson I hope people take from this. Not just about land, but about principle, about drawing lines that matter. Not every fight needs a court or a crowd. Sometimes all you need is a fence, a paper trail, and a spine made of something strong. A few months after things calmed down, the new HOA board invited me to one of their meetings. They wanted me to talk about property rights and how to better communicate with landowners outside their community. I was hesitant at first, but curiosity got the better of me. I went not as an opponent, but as someone who knew the value of peace. They were polite, respectful, even grateful. One woman said, "Your situation changed how we operate. We don't make assumptions anymore. We double check, we ask permission, and we remember that not every neighbor lives by our rules. And that's okay." That meeting was quiet, but it meant a lot. It showed me that even the biggest mistakes can lead to something better if people are willing to learn. It also reminded me that just because someone wears a badge or holds a title doesn't mean they're always right. Authority without humility is just noise. But authority paired with respect, that's something else. Back at the farm, life stayed simple. I repaired fence posts. I watered the tomatoes. I cleaned out the barn loft and found an old photo of my grandfather standing in the same field, holding a shovel, smiling under the same sun. He never dealt with HOAs or easement surveys, but he dealt with men who tried to tell him how to live. And from the look in his eyes, I knew he didn't back down either. Sometimes I wonder what he'd think of all this. Probably chuckle. Probably say, "Good job keeping the land in your name, boy." And I'd smile and say, "It wasn't easy, but it was worth it, because this land isn't just soil and wood and wire. It's memory. It's the place where my kids took their first steps, where my wife and I built a home, where dogs are buried under oak trees, and stories live in every corner, and nobody, not a board, not a builder, not a polished man in khakis gets to decide what happens here but me. The irony is, I never set out to challenge anything. I didn't want to fight. I didn't plan to cut the power or stand at meetings, or be quoted in newspapers. All I ever wanted was to be left alone, to work the land that I love, and to live in peace. But sometimes, peace comes only after the storm, and when the storm ends, the land is stronger for it. One morning in early fall, I stood at the edge of my pasture with a thermos of coffee, watching the mist roll in across the field. The new fence line gleamed in the morning light. The signs were still up, not as warnings anymore, but as reminders. Reminders that this place is spoken for. That every inch of it has been earned, guarded, loved. A truck slowed near the main road. The window rolled down, and a man I didn't recognize called out, "You're the guy from the story, right?" I nodded slowly. He gave a thumbs up and said, "Glad you didn't give up. That's all, and sometimes, that's enough." It's a strange feeling, knowing your story's been passed from porch to porch, told over dinners and in town halls. But if it helps someone else remember that they have rights, that they have a voice, that they can push back, then I'm proud of it. Not because I won a battle, but because I reminded people that ownership still matters. That land is more than square footage. It's part of who we are. And when someone threatens that, we don't just stand still, we rise, we protect, we remember, and we pass it down. The world's changing faster than it ever has. But out here, under this sky, things still grow the old way, slow, steady, and strong. And so do the people who live on it. I'll probably never hear from the HOA again. They've got their rules, their gardens, their block parties, and that's fine. But they've also got new respect, a line they now know better than to cross. And neighbors who know they're not powerless anymore. And me, I'll be right here, in the same boots, on the same porch, looking over the same land, watching it hold firm, the way it always has, and always will. Because out here, we don't need to raise our voices, we just hold the line, and that's enough.